and yeah, it's just an honor to be part of this all and to help host it and to be part of it. I'm really excited to just participate and share what little knowledge I have. And I was talking with Bridget about what I could contribute maybe to this conference, and other than my technical skills as a host. I know a little bit about GMOs and glyphosate, so I'll talk about that today a little bit and the impact that it seems to be having on plant, soil, and human health. So a little bit about my background. I'm the IT co-coordinator with Lucille Contreras for Honor the Earth, Anishinaabe Agriculture, and Winona's Hemp Farm. My background is basically in technology. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science from Minnesota State. But after 20 years in the IT industry, I've gotten a little bit burnt out on the IT side. So I decided to get more into the health and wellness space and learn about anatomy, physiology. So I studied that at Minnesota State Tech. I was recently admitted into the Masters of Arts program at the University of Minnesota for health and wellness coaching, the Science of Spirituality and Healing, or the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And I'm a volunteer worker at the Organic Compound. So I do a lot of work at the local organic farm in Faribault, Minnesota. And I'm an independent researcher on environmental toxins like glyphosate, which is a big one. We all know it's part of the chemical Roundup and used pervasively in agricultural systems. So it's definitely at the top of the list whenever you look at environmental toxins, along with other pesticides like dicambia and Liberty Link, which are two lesser known ones, but also very toxic. Things like PFOAs, which are a byproduct of Teflon production from like Dow Chemical, and PM 2.5, which is fine particulate matter, basically air pollution. So GMOs and glyphosate. I'll talk a little bit about the history about GMOs and glyphosate, where they came from, how they've evolved over the past 30 years. I'll go into a little bit about what glyphosate is without getting too technical or detail oriented, but there are a few key points that I think are worth noting. And finally, the impact that it's having on the soil, plants, and ultimately the climate health, and ultimately human health as well. And also some potential solutions. A lot of problems with the agrochemicals. So talking about solutions is really important. And food sovereignty, of course, has been a huge one, a huge topic and theme over the past few days. And so we'll talk about that as a potential solution for combating the widespread use of GMOs and glyphosate. And some Q&A at the end. If anybody has any questions, I'll hop on chat and answer them if anybody has any. So what is glyphosate? That's the question I asked when I first started researching it. Like, I had no idea what this stuff is and what it's doing. So that's where I began. What is glyphosate? It's the #1 agrochemical produced in the world and the active ingredient in Roundup. It's an organophosphate, which is just a large word for it's a combined amino acid with other amino acids together, creating this chemical. It's based on the essential amino acid glycine, which is like the most prevalent protein in our body. So that could be causing some potential health issues, and I'll go into that. It works in conjunction with GMO plants, obviously. GMO plants are designed to be glyphosate Roundup resistant, which is why they work as great as a weed killer. And actually, glyphosate is a patented antibiotic, and a lot of people don't know that it's basically patented to kill microbial life in the soil, and that's how it works in conjunction with the GMOs to create a substance that is able to kill weeds. And it's used as a crop desiccant, so it's used to dry out wheat. So in wheat farming, the farmers spray it on the wheat prior to harvest to get a faster harvest, so it dries out faster. Some of the history behind GMOs and glyphosate, really it goes back to the early 1900s and probably a little bit before that. But there was a German scientist named Fritz Haber that created the first pesticides and nitrogen-based fertilizers. So that's really where the birth of pesticides and stuff like glyphosate began. In 1960 to 1972, the Vietnam War was going on, and Dow Chemical and Monsanto kind of took Haber's work and turned it into a chemical called Agent Orange, which is also an organophosphate. Not exactly glyphosate, but sort of in the same family, because in the Vietnam War, we used it to defoliate the jungle, so we had better access to the Viet Cong. So it was used as a chemical weapon effectively. Towards the end of the Vietnam War, we realized it was causing cancer, so we had to stop spraying it. And when the Vietnam War ended around 1972 to 1975, that's where we started to come up with a new use. You know, glyphosate, Dow and Monsanto have all this infrastructure in place to create glyphosate. Now they have no way to use it. So we end up, the scientists' wheels start turning and they start coming up with things like GMOs to genetically engineer plants to be glyphosate resistant. And so we find a new use for these a chemical weapon essentially to defoliate plants. It was originally used as a residential weed killer and I believe a pipe cleaner, also a crop desiccant, as I mentioned before. And in the mid 1990s, that's when commercial use of GMOs actually began and widespread use of glyphosate started and still exists today. Here's a map of the different the progression of agrochemical use in the world. In the 1990s, you can see on the left here, there's a map that shows the different concentrations of pesticide use in the different areas of the continents. You see in the North America here, it's kind of light green and it got darker throughout the years. And in 2017, you can see the changes that have evolved over time in South America. Countries like China, which has always been a heavy user of glyphosate. Excuse me. And China is pretty much the #1 consumer of glyphosate today. US and South America are right behind them. So impacts on the soil and water. Glyphosate seems to be disrupting this. Obviously, it's a patented antibiotic, so it disrupts the microbial life in the soil microbiome. When you destroy the microbial life in the soil, you create a degraded ability for it to sequester carbon in the atmosphere. Soil and water really help to sequester carbon. So when you kill the life in the soil, you end up killing the life in the water as well. Because of the soil runoff that happens. And I'll go into a little bit more about that as we go on. And then it ends up disturbing the small and large water cycles, which ends up altering the micro and macro climates, which inevitably leads to global things like climate change. And it's a water soluble chemical. So as I mentioned, it gets sprayed in the land, it ends up in the river tributaries and ends up in the entire water system. Some of the impacts that glyphosate has on plants is it disrupts an enzyme called the shikimate pathway in the soil microbes, the fungi and plants as well. And this pathway doesn't exist in humans, so that's how glyphosate is actually allowed to be legal and is deemed safe for consumption, when really it disrupts all of these other things that are part of us as well. So it has a lot of downstream impacts to humans ultimately. Three of the main things it inhibits are amino acids like tryptophan, phenylalanine, and tyrosine, which are the precursors to dopamine and serotonin. So two very important neurotransmitters that we need. And obviously, dopamine and serotonin are used throughout the body in a lot of different ways. Serotonin is used in the digestive process and a lot of different processes in the brain. So definitely an important neurotransmitter that if we're missing in our diets due to glyphosate, it's going to cause a lot of downstream health impacts. And another problem is that weeds eventually become glyphosate resistant. So we end up having to spray more and more glyphosate and use more and more chemical inputs on the land, which of course degrades the land even further. Impacts on humans and animals. If you read a lot of literature in standard, Monsanto's literature, they'll say that it doesn't impact humans because it impacts the pathways that humans don't have. But of course, we do have a microbiome. So that's a big word that a lot of is really being used today in a lot of different circles. And so it impacts the microbiome, obviously. It's a patented antibiotic. So if it gets in the soil, killing the microbial life in the soil. It's, we eat things that come from the soil and the plants. So it gets in our gut and kills the microbial life in our gut as well. So this lack of microbial life and microbial diversity on the land kind of mimics the lack of microbial diversity in our guts and our bodies. And this causes it seems to be causing all kinds of different metabolic impacts with things like the liver function, activating vitamin D, and our ability to detoxify a lot of different toxic chemicals that we are exposed to. Depletes glutathiones. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's one of the body's main antioxidants that's created in the liver. And glycine, which I mentioned is what glyphosate is created from, is one of the 3 amino acids that's needed to produce glutathione. It breaks down the tight gap junctions in our endothelial tissues, and we have endothelial tissues, hard word to say, all throughout our body, mostly in our gut lining. So all throughout our large and small intestines, we have this thin layer of tight gap junctions. It's like 1 micron or 50 microns thick, which is about the width of a human hair. And that's pretty much the only layer that's protecting all the toxins that get in our system from our immune system. So if that layer breaks down, you end up getting acute immune response. And if you get a series of acute immune responses, you end up getting chronic immune responses. So chronic autoimmune diseases today are really a big problem. And it's evolved over the past 30 years quite a bit, and it's really increased in rates in a lot of different areas as well. So as I mentioned, it's an organophosphate, and here's a chemical structure of what glyphosate looks like. And here's a chemical structure of what glycine looks like. And as you can see, it's kind of similar. Excuse me. So glyphosate is synthesized from glycine. So these chemical structures are very similar. And so that potentially is causing a lot of issues. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that without getting too geeky or technical. But one thing to point out is that glycine is an essential amino acid. We need glycine in our bodies. Our proteins are created from it. So every time your body creates a protein, whether it be joints, ligaments, bones, anything like that, also a lot of different tissues, a lot of enzymes, glutathione, antioxidants, all need this glycine molecule. And when you take in glyphosate, the body can get confused. It can get confused trying to make these proteins with glycine, but if it sees a glyphosate molecule, it might get in there. And so it's like a Lego piece that doesn't fit quite right together. And a lot of the science that I'm reading seems to be saying that this glyphosate glycine switch seems to be a really big issue. So what is the microbiome? It's a lot of different things. The environment has a microbiome, the water has a microbiome, the air, land, everything has a microbiome. But on a human level, it's included in a lot of different things: the water, the food, everything in our body. Especially in our gut area, you have things like bacteria, parasites, fungi, and viruses are all part of our internal ecosystem, which makes up our microbiome. And as you can see, humans, our DNA is mapped for 20,000 genes, but bacteria, 40,000 different species, which we can have any number of these in our internal microbiome at any one time, can be up to 2 million genes. We all have parasites in our system. Can be up to 5 billion genes, fungi, 125 trillion, and viruses, an estimated 10 to the 31 different viruses. So that's 10 with 31 zeros. That's, I think, about 100 million times or 10 million times the number of stars in the entire universe. So there's a lot of viruses, and all of these are part of our internal ecosystem and make up the microbiome as a whole. So why is it important to animals? As I mentioned, the tight and gap junctions, the thin layer of protection that we have from toxins in the environment, located all throughout our body. Microbiome is really important in digestion and nutrition absorption. So when we eat something, we don't really digest it. Our stomach really doesn't digest it. All of the stomach aids in digestion, but really it's the microbiome that's breaking down the nutrients in the food and giving us the nutrients and making them bioavailable to the rest of our cells. And in turn, it helps the cells perform something called redox signaling, which is basically when a cell gets damaged, which all our cells are constantly being damaged and repaired. So redox signaling is what helps the cells repair themselves and regenerate. When you have a lack of a microbiome, they're finding that this redox signaling doesn't work quite right. So that definitely creates a lot of downstream health impacts. And as I mentioned, the creation of enzymes, antioxidants, proteins, and neurotransmitters are all, the microbiome contributes to all of those things as well. So here's a picture of what, little cartoony picture of what a tight and gap junction looks like. So here's some what a normal intestinal barrier, tight junction, gap junction would look like. So each individual, you can think of these as each individual cells that are kind of tied together with these gap junctions. And when you get stuff in exposure like toxins like glyphosate, these gap junctions kind of break apart, and bad bacteria, toxins, undigested food gets in our bloodstream and our lymphatic system, which causes a heavy load on our immune system. Here's a microscopic view of what healthy tight junction cells might look like. I believe this is a picture of a small intestine under a microscope. As you can see this on the slide here, all of these cells are kind of compacted together. They're tightly knit together and they're grouped together, so not a lot of toxins. But as soon as you expose it to something like glyphosate, they kind of break apart, even at 20 parts per million, which is very, very tiny, probably in the amount you would see in a normal potato. So really, even just the smallest amount of glyphosate is really causing our cells to not function as they should. So glyphosate potential impacts on human health trends. Take a look at some of the human health trends over the past 30 years since glyphosate has been sprayed on a wide scale. Autism is a big one. In the mid-90s, autism really wasn't a big thing at all. I never heard of it. I went to high school. I never heard of anybody having it in the mid-90s, and didn't really hear of anybody having autism at all. Past 30 years, the rates of autism have gone way up, and right alongside of glyphosate. So this line in red right here represents the spraying of glyphosate in pounds per acre, along with the rates of autism for 100,000 people. So definitely a huge increase there. Ulcerative colitis has gone way up, and that's an autoimmune disorder. This one really hits home to me because around the year 2000, I got this condition and I was diagnosed with it, and I've dealt with it for quite a few years now. Really brutal disease of the gastrointestinal system, and I won't go into all the details, but it's not pleasant. So it causes that, or it's definitely probably a contributor to that due to all the immune impacts that I talked about. Definitely a likely candidate for just being a huge factor in all autoimmune conditions. Diabetes is a big one. You can see from 1980, really diabetes wasn't a huge issue. Obviously, as we progress along, and about 30 years ago when we started spraying glyphosate, you see huge spikes in diabetes. And if you saw Gather, the film on Friday night, you saw that the Native communities were especially hit hard by diabetes. It's a big problem in the Native communities. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Native Americans are twice as likely to have diabetes as other nationalities and cultures. 2 out of 3 Native Americans have kidney failure due to diabetes. And here's a little graph that shows the disparities, the different rates that you see in Native Americans, 16% compared to 8% in whites. So huge discrepancy. And obviously in the poorer the communities, the less access to good, healthy foods are going to be available. And so you see that the discrepancy in health for sure. And here's a graph of renal stage or renal deaths, which is basically kidney failure, also gone lock and step right alongside the rate of glyphosate, along with the kidney deaths as well. So the World Health Organization labeled glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. And so we know that Monsanto and Dow, or Bayer now, has paid out billions of dollars in different cancer claims. So we know that it's definitely a major contributor to a lot of different types of cancer, lymph cancer of all different kinds. I think it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a major one that it's pretty much known to cause now. So here's a map of the USA, and again, glyphosate in 1992 really wasn't sprayed that much on a very large scale at all. And you can see as we progress in the Midwest, it gets darker and darker. So in this light colored yellow here, it's less than 2 pounds per square mile of glyphosate, and dark red over here represents over 100 pounds per square mile. So it's increased 50-fold over the last 30 years. And the USA consumes, did I lose that? 25% of the world's glyphosate. And here's a map of the river tributaries in the US. And all of these river tributaries feed the Mississippi. So if you kind of look at both of these maps side by side, you can see that that the more glyphosate we're spraying, and it's a water soluble chemical, so as we're spraying it, it's ending up in these river tributaries, which are going to end up in the main Mississippi River, which feeds into the Gulf of Mexico. And if we look at the Gulf of Mexico and what's going on there, at the end of the Mississippi, we have a 9,000 square mile dead zone. And that's a huge issue because a dead zone, nothing, just like it sounds, no aquatic life can grow in a dead zone. So you have a huge area where there's just a lack of life, and really that didn't happen naturally. There's something man-made that we're doing to contribute to that. And you know, glyphosate is definitely a candidate for that. Obviously, there's a lot of other things, a lot of industrialization going on in the South there, especially between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. There's an 80-mile stretch called Cancer Alley, and there's a huge rate of cancer there, and there's a lot of industrialization, a lot of big factories right along the Mississippi River there, probably all contributing to this dead zone. But I'm pretty convinced that glyphosate is at least a little bit of a factor, if not a major factor. So soil erosion, along with impacting the land, water, and the ocean water, soil erosion is another huge issue that happens when you use conventional agriculture today, when we're spraying adding a lot of chemical inputs like glyphosate and having to add more like nitrogen inputs to the soil. It hampers the soil's ability to sequester carbon. And when you hamper the ability to sequester carbon, you create changes to small and large water cycles, which is basically the micro and macro climates. And when you change enough of these micro and macro climates, you end up changing climate change on a global scale. And a lot of what the Paris Agreement talked about in 2016 was how to address some of these agricultural issues and create more of a way to create agriculture in a way that creates more of a carbon drawdown, where we're, instead of putting more carbon in the atmosphere, we're at least becoming carbon neutral and not doing more harm than we are doing good sequestering the carbon. So in the 1930s, there was something called the Dust Bowl, where a lot of the Midwestern plains and even in Canada and probably throughout the world, there was a huge drying of soils because there were a lot of the farming practices we had at the time were just using tillage over and over again. And when you till soil, you create more bare ground. More bare ground creates more quick evaporation, so the soil dries out, the soil life dies. And we're obviously no soil, no plants, so no ability to sequester carbon. 200 million acres of cropland were damaged. So that led to a huge economic downturn. And of course, in the 1930s, there was also the Great Depression. And so a lot of people don't really know that this lack of agriculture and how we were using agriculture at the time was a huge catalyst to the Great Depression itself. So as I mentioned, evaporation versus transpiration, two basic concepts. You know, if you have bare soil, you're going to get a lot of quick evaporation, a lot of CO2, and water gets absorbed into the atmosphere. You have a lot of cover crops, things growing on the soil at all times. You get more of a carbon drawdown, and you create more of those natural cycles where carbon is sequestered naturally. So here's a quick little chart of how the water cycle works. You know, you have condensation that builds up, you have precipitation that rains down, you have collection of water, and then evaporation back into the atmosphere. So this cycle repeats on the macro scale or micro scale and expands outwardly to a macro scale as we impact the land and the water. Here's an example, a quick little example of plant and soil carbon oxygen cycle. So, you know, as we know, plants need solar energy, carbon, and water to create plant life. The plant life uses these things, creates carbohydrates in the soil for the soil organisms. The soil organisms feed on that, and the soil microbes then use respiration and put carbon back into the atmosphere. So there's that natural cycle that's supposed to occur. But when we end up disturbing the soil and the soil life, that cycle gets broken, and you end up with bare ground, and you get too much evaporation. The ground dries out, so you create a vicious cycle, basically. Here's a satellite image of the carbon, of a picture of how much carbon is in the atmosphere. And this happens every year. And so here's a picture from July where there's not a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So what happens in July? We're farming, where a lot of life is growing on the land. So you're getting a lot of that natural carbon drawdown. You know, when it gets into the winter months, plant life dies, and then you end up having a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. So this is a normal cycle, really. There's nothing abnormal with this, but this is just to point out that there's definitely a natural cycle. You know, fossil fuels and things like that are definitely causing more carbon in the atmosphere as well. But it's really this natural agricultural cycle that we have as humans that creates the large amount of the carbon in the atmosphere. It definitely impacts that. So the more we impact these small microclimates, it definitely has an impact on how these cycles function throughout the year and over time, of course. So potential solutions. Of course, soil management, protecting the soil, protecting the mycelium networks in the soil, and the bacteria, the microbial life is obviously really important. Doing things like permaculture and regenerative agricultural practice, no-till or low-till farming practices, so we're not disturbing the soil so much and making it, creating a lot of evaporation and drying out the soil. Using things like composting, recycling of organic material, stuff like managed grazing. So a lot of the problem with our agricultural system is that we have like factory farms, and we have factory farms that are fed with cows with like GMO corn and soy as a lot of the feed. So we're requiring a lot of land area that's used in monocrops, and so things like that are really contributing a lot to a lot of these disturbances of these water cycles and climate change. So eat local and organic when possible. Know your local farmer and CSA. That's huge, because the more local we get, obviously, the more we're able to control how we get our food and the quality of food that we get. Eat fresh foods. Obviously, the fresher your food, the more healthy the microbiome is on the food, and the better for our guts. Avoid factory farm meats, as I mentioned. Factory farm meats, a big issue, because of the way the cows are raised, and a lot of the other livestock, and how they're managed. So that's a huge reason why we're not able to sequester a lot of carbon, is because we're not managing the way we have our animals on the land. Natural buffalo that roam the land, as we saw in the movie Gather, when they're allowed to roam the land naturally, they're a lot more healthy. That young lady did that science experiment, which is really cool, where she pretty much proved that buffalo meat was a lot healthier than cow meat. So there's a reason for that, and I think it's just not buffalo versus cow. It's where these animals are at. And so when animals are not allowed to naturally graze, you get those natural cycles. The cows and buffalo are, pooping on the land and putting the soil microbes back into the land. Natural composting. Eat fermented foods. I eat fermented foods every day, and it's a big part of my diet. They have a lot of good bacteria, putting good bacteria in your gut. So when you're eating a lot of unhealthy foods, you're decimating your gut biome. So fermented foods help put it back. And of course, food sovereignty. That's a huge one. Of course, the more sovereign we are with our food, the more we're able to control where our food comes from, and the healthier to be, obviously. And we vote with our dollars. So the less we spend on products that are sourced from consumer or conventional agriculture, the more money we have, and the healthier we'll be. And preferably with heirloom seeds. So don't use, obviously, any seeds that don't come from heirloom sources. So the original seeds from these plants and fruits are ideal. And obviously connect with the earth, water, plants, land, and animals. We get a lot of microbiome through our diets, but we also get it through just interacting and being outside, being in nature. That's where a lot of the microbiome is. It's everywhere, as I mentioned, and it's part of us. And so, if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to take them on the chat. I'll stop sharing here. See if I can open it up. Looking here. Laurelini, I'll definitely post a link to the slides if anybody wants to download them. Sure, absolutely. I have a link to all my sources too. I have about 50 different links, so I'll be happy to post those as well if you want to look at any of the references that I've used. Carl, is that pounds per acre? I'd have to go back and look at the slides, Carl, to see if that's pounds per acre. I believe that, it is pounds per square acre. Linda, wearing clothes that are organic and fibers that do not rely on much on glyphosate, like hemp. Absolutely, yes, that's a big one that I forgot to mention. Cotton is one of the worst plants that contains things like glyphosate. We spray it on cotton plants as well. So, in all our non-organic clothing, we're getting exposed to glyphosate in that way too. I'm not sure to what degree, but obviously it definitely is a lot better to wear like natural fibers, like hemp fibers that are grown from organic sources. It's got to be better for our skin. Our skin is one of our main organs, so we're definitely absorb a lot of things through our skin. And so definitely organic clothing and hemp clothing would be amazing idea for that. So many of these times strategies for people. So Cherish, you asked a great question. You say many of these strategies are possible for people with time and resources, but what strategies can be used by single working moms and other people in difficult financial situations? You know, that's something I think a lot of us face, honestly. It's a really tough question. Obviously, it's easy to say, yeah, go eat organic, avoid GMOs, but it's really tough. Of course, GMOs are cheap and they're easy. And, a lot of us don't have the time or money to invest in good, healthy foods. And Cherish, I think for me, when I first started realizing some of this stuff, I don't have a lot of money either. So it was one of those things where I said, I'm going to make small changes to my diet. I'm going to just, grow some of my own food. So I'm growing, not a lot of it, but I grow some of my own food, my own herbs. I ferment food, which is a huge thing, I think, that is really helpful in our diets as well, because they put good bacteria in our stomach and in our guts and throughout our entire bodies it impacts. So I think that just doing small things that you can, like, going to local farmers markets and maybe, utilizing those to get, cheap sources of food. So I think it's just about, making small incremental changes as you can. And I think that as more and more people make these small incremental changes, you encourage more and more local farmers in your communities to come together and grow food and share food. So you get a more gravitation towards these, communal and land-based resources, and as you shy away from using external resources or commercially available resources. So to me, that would be the biggest one, is just make small changes as you can and try to avoid it utilizing things like foods that come in boxes, things that we know are GMOs. And I'm looking through the questions still to see if I see any more. Kat, as a crop desiccant, is it legal to use an organic wheat and other grain crops? I don't know for sure. I think to be USDA organic certified, you can't obviously use glyphosate as a crop desiccant. So, but I don't know what other maybe organic based inputs, because I know there are some legal organic inputs, but I'm not sure as far as wheat goes, how that impacts organic wheat and other organic crops. So I'd have to look into that, but that's a great question. I never really thought of that. I just assumed that organic wheat farmers didn't utilize the practice of using a crop desiccant, but perhaps they do, and I'm just unaware of it. At a fermentation workshop for next year. Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. I make kefir water, kombucha, fermented curry cauliflower, sauerkraut, all great stuff. And what I've noticed with fermentation, we can talk a little bit about that, is that it really, fermentation acts as, it really changes your gut. And we know it impacts our health, but fermentation really impacts to me, it impacts our diet. Like, I crave more fermented foods the more I eat. So I think it really, mentally, it has an impact. So I mentioned that the microbiome is really a precursor to some of those neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. So I noticed definitely a mood change it's almost like a vitamin. I almost look at fermented foods like as an essential vitamin because of the way it acts in our body, and it definitely impacts a lot of different good neurotransmitters. I feel a lot better when I eat fermented foods. So I know it's definitely causing some positive impacts for sure. What groups are fighting glyphosate? There's a lot of different groups, Kat. You can look into Farmers Footprint, or yeah, I believe Farmers Footprint does. The Rodale Institute is a big one that is fighting glyphosate. You can check out a documentary on Netflix called Kiss the Ground. They talk a lot about glyphosate there and the different ways that it's being combated today, and some of the history behind it. That's where I actually got a lot of my information from too, is those resources. Forrest, how long does glyphosate stay in the body? I know it's differing. That's another reason why they think glyphosate is safe, Forrest, is that glyphosate passes right through your body a lot. So if you take in like 100 micrograms of glyphosate, let's say, like 99 of those micrograms get passed through your urine almost a day or two after. But it's that 1% of glyphosate that stays in your body that isn't really accounted for. So it actually, since it's an amino acid, it gets combined to the structure of our body. So if you picture collagen, per se, like in our joints and bones, so that's all made of glycine, and that's the primary protein in collagen, is that glycine molecule. So if you get a bone structure or ligaments or joints that are created with glyphosate instead of glycine, the natural molecule, you're going to it's going to end up staying in your body for as long as it stays in your joints. And our tissues constantly regenerate themselves. So it's hard to say exactly where it stays and exactly where it stores. I don't think we really know, but it could stay a long time. And I think that's how we get it through animal products. So when animals are fed glyphosate and GMOs, that ends up storing in their tissue itself. So when we eat non-organically fed animals, all of that glyphosate that's stored in their body is going to end up in our body as well. Let's see. I was going to say something else about that, but I can't remember. Josie, is the increase in autism linked to what glyphosate does to the GI tract? Very good question. I've looked into that a little bit, and I really believe it does, because the GI tract is the foundation for everything. So like 90% of serotonin is produced in our gut. And so, as I mentioned about with Forrest, how long glyphosate stays in the body, and the fact that there seems to be that glyphosate substitution going on. I know the myelin sheath, which is the little areas around the synapses in our brain, those are also made of proteins as well. So anytime you impact the biome in the gut, you're going to impact the brain as well. And so if you guys want to look into like Dr. Zach Bush on YouTube, he talks all about this phenomenon, and he did an interview with Neurohacker not too long ago, and he talks all about that gut-brain connection and how important it is, and some of the potential links behind why glyphosate impacts the gut, which has a downstream impact and has a lot of potential neurological issues due to the degradation of the myelin sheath. All right, so we have a few more minutes here. See any more questions? All right, food stamps programs, a lot of folks don't have time to go to the place. Space is too light. Yeah, grouping. Yeah, Kat, I think that's a great point. Yeah, a lot of these solutions I know aren't feasible for some people, and yeah, the more poor your communities are, the less access you're going to have to these resources. So I think it is really about spreading knowledge, like sharing knowledge, like I've shared today. The more research you can do, the more knowledgeable you can become. Like I've shared with all my friends, you know, I don't have a conversation with somebody very long before I start talking about glyphosate and the importance of it. And so it's just creating communities with whoever you're with. And the more that you create those communities, the more that we can kind of group together. You know, this, not one person can make a change, but when we connect with each other, it's kind of like the tight gap junctions that are formed together in our gut. I just realized that those cells are supposed to be side by side by side. And when you get things like glyphosate breaking them up, you get those gaps, and you know, individual cells that don't have that connection with others kind of lose their purpose and they become cancer cells. So I really think that the solution really lies in community. Absolutely. And the more that we can do community gardening and sharing of food, not only is that special and sacred, but it obviously it's going to have a downstream impact on our health. Dr. Mercola also speaks about glyphosate as the most natural medicine response. Absolutely. Mercola is a big one. Again, I mentioned Dr. Zach Bush. If you YouTube Dr. Mercola and Zach Bush, they have a pretty close relationship. And I've actually taken a course online with Dr. Zach Bush. Amazing doctor. I've learned so much from him. A lot of what I presented today was a direct result of what I learned through Zach and his work with Farmer's Footprint. And so, yeah. Marcella, you weren't able to see the presentation. Do you have any thoughts about detoxifying our bodies? Great. Yes, I do have a lot of thoughts about that. And I only have a couple of minutes left. I can share those in the chat later. But yeah, detoxifying. There's a lot of different things you can do to detoxify other than avoid non-organic food, of course. Fermented foods is a great way to detoxify. Drinking clean sources of water. As I mentioned, glyphosate is water soluble. So it's in our water supply. So if you're drinking water out of the tap, you're probably getting a heavy load of glyphosate there too. So I drink filtered water. I try to drink distilled filtered water or water that isn't run through the municipal system. So anytime you can filter your water and you're filtering out a lot of those chemicals, that's a big way. I take something called ion biome, which is basically a humic extract. It's a soil extract from the soil that helps those tight gap junctions not break apart. So I utilize that, and so you can look into humic extracts. That's a great one. I know Purium makes another one of a special chemical or a special probiotic that's specifically designed for glyphosate detoxification. All right, so I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. It's been a great conference. Really appreciate everybody's participation. And again, it's been an honor to share some of what I know about this subject. And obviously, it's popular. And we'd be glad to talk to anybody offline. Feel free to message me anytime. Be happy to talk more about this. So, miigwech, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.